Hi, Tim Blankenship here with Divorce661.com. And in this episode, we're talking about a couple things. It's actually a phone conversation I had, and we talked about several topics. And instead of going over these in separate episodes, I thought I would just combine my end of the conversation in answering the questions that were asked of me during the call. We talked about things such as the issues that happen when you start a divorce and never finalize it, and a lot of time goes by. We talk about how is someone able to get married if they're still married. We also talked about why it's difficult to finalize your divorce when you don't know where the other party is. In cases of divorce cases that start along many years ago, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, and you don't keep track of where the spouse is and then need to finalize, that becomes problematic. And what you need to do in order to find your spouse, because you cannot finalize your divorce in most cases without the other your spouse's signature. So whether that's hiring a private investigator, but I do go into a little detail on what that needs to look like. And in handling old cases, what was asked of me is, since my wife was able to get remarried, is there anything stopping me from getting remarried without finalizing the divorce? And he had some reasons why he may want to do that. And so we talk about that as well. Hope you like this new format. It's Tim Blankenship, Divorce661.com. Enjoy. Yeah, I can see on your case file that you guys went to court a few times, perhaps, and other than that, it doesn't look like much else got done. You definitely need to turn in your final agreement, your judgment, and it doesn't look like any of the procedural forms were done either. So it looks just like a case was filed, there was a response filed, and that's about it. Yeah, so there's nothing that would really stop her from getting remarried without the divorce being finalized. Usually the way that is determined or found out is when someone's getting married through a church and they want a copy of the divorce decree to make sure that the divorce is final. But if she just went to like the county window or even in, like you said, another state, they don't do any background checks before they issue a license, a new marriage license, to see if a divorce has been finalized, and they don't even ask if they've been previously married. So that's issue one. Yeah, so I mean, this divorce still needs to be finalized, and it's going to be very difficult if you don't know where she is any longer, because she's going to have to sign. There's some paperwork she has to sign as well to finalize this. This will never go through without you locating her and you getting signatures on all the final paperwork. Yeah, your first step is going to be to do whatever social media, try and track her down. Even if you have to hire a private investigator to search, for credit history and where where her addresses are being used on credit applications and stuff like that. When both parties have entered the case, where a petition's filed and a response is filed, your divorce won't finalize until you guys sign a final agreement, which at this point, since the minor child is now over 18, it would just be a matter of whatever the agreement was or is, and being that it's been so long, it might just be that there's no assets and debts to divide, there's no money changing hands, and vice versa. It's your call. That's obviously a financial decision which way you want to go. Step one, like if you called me and said, "Yeah, I know where she lives. We just need," and this happens all the time, where a long time goes in between the divorce being started and then not being finalized. We've handled some as long as old as 25 years old that they never finalized. So, if that was the case, I would just do your final paperwork. I'm sure we need to update your addresses with the court for the most part, and then do your judgment. But step one for you is going to be trying to locate her, because nothing's going to be able to happen without her signatures. You're not doing anything wrong. There's no laws you're breaking per se. Just that your new wife would be able to get your new marriage annulled if you didn't dissolve the first marriage, if that makes sense. So let me explain. If you got married, nothing would happen. Nothing would go wrong. In fact, I've done a divorce for several people who have been already married, new kids, new everything, new life, and we had to finalize the divorce from their past one. So all that would happen was let's say you got married today and you never finalized your divorce. Your current wife would at any time be able to petition the court to annul your marriage, even 20 years down the road, say based on the fact that there's a pre-existing marriage. So that's the only downside. No, if you guys, the only time this has come up is people went to get married through a church, and they've asked to see the divorce decree, and then they could locate it, and then they realize the divorce was never finalized. That's usually what comes up. But I had someone call me 2 months ago who's been married 4 times, and she's never done one divorce, and they didn't. I don't know what her issues were, but I'm just trying to prove to you that you can just keep getting married, and unless someone calls you on it, like a church asking for proof, no one's ever going to know.